You're listening to Hoedown History, where we explore the history and legends of America's old time and bluegrass music. It's one of the most beautiful and intricate fiddle tunes out there. It's a standard in both the bluegrass and old time genres. And while it appears to be a fairly old piece, its popularity is actually a relatively recent phenomena. And we're pretty lucky to even have this piece of great music because if it wasn't for one fiddler from West Virginia, it probably would have been lost forever. And the story of how this tune was eventually preserved is a good one. So stick around because we'll explore the history of Big Sciota, from the people who helped capture our first recordings of it to its development and transformations during both the old-time music revival of the 1970s to its emergence into the bluegrass world in the 1990s. And we'll even discuss what that title means. So let's dive in. Our story begins with this man, Alan Jabbour. He was born in 1942 in Jacksonville, Florida, his father having immigrated to the United States from Syria. Alan started playing classical violin at the age of 7. His father, who had played a very different stringed instrument before he left Syria called the oud, recognized Alan's musical talent and encouraged and protected it. Like, literally protected it. His father owned a grocery store, and Alan would help out at the shop as a kid. But his father wouldn't let him actually cut the meat at the butcher counter, since most butchers he knew were missing a joint. While Alan was still only in high school and still working at the shop, his musical talent landed him a spot playing with the Jacksonville Symphony, and he would continue to play with various prominent classical orchestras throughout the next several years. But after he earned his bachelor's degree, he decided he no longer wanted to be a professional musician, and he put aside the violin. That is, until something happened rather quickly that would change Alan's direction in life. In 1964, Alan moved to Durham, North Carolina, to attend Duke University to pursue a graduate degree in English. He decided he would focus on medieval studies, and during his first semester, he took a course on medieval balladry. This seminar immersed him in all types of old ballads and also taught him the process of collecting old folklore. During this particular course, the professor, who is also a fiddler from Scandinavia, would play some old tunes and also some old time recordings from the Library of Congress. And, well, that was it. As Alan recalls, quote, I was smitten. There was something culturally powerful in that music. I thought there and then I had discovered the real thing, and that this is what I wanted to learn about. Alan rode off to the library and got some records for himself, and for over the remaining part of his studies, listened to them over and over again. Alan eventually went on to write his master's thesis on the collection and analysis of folk songs in the British Isles in America, and he also got the idea that, with his special knowledge of violin, he should go out and collect some folk fiddling of his own. Now, it's interesting to note here both Alan's fascination with traditional fiddle music and his experience growing up as a child of a Syrian immigrant, where his family was very conscious, as many Syrian families are, of maintaining their culture. He said in a later interview that growing up in the South in the 60s, there was a lot of cultural revolution going on, and it forced everybody to think a lot about culture. That's another reason, maybe, that he got interested in folklore, because when you're a Southerner growing up in that world that's changing, you're forced to think about what to actually preserve. So in 1965, Allen bought a cheap tape recorder and started his journey of folk collecting in North Durham County. At one point, he stopped at a gas station and just asked if there were any fiddlers around. Within a few minutes, he met a young man who played fiddle and banjo. They talked for a while, and this young man encouraged Alan to actually try playing the music himself. And from that point on, Alan's documentation trips turned from just passive recording to a more active process of apprenticeship. At the time, Alan had not played his violin for about a year. Now he would begin learning old tunes from his newfound mentors. But like a lot of classic violinists who turn to fiddling, he had to develop a new way to learn. Classical musicians rely a lot on printed music, but now Alan had to use just his ears. The tape recordings he started making helped. After he made his tapes, he would play the recordings back at half speed, which gave him time to hear what was actually happening, especially with the specific bowing patterns. Alan would eventually discover and make recordings of many old time musicians, including the legendary fiddler and banjo player Henry Reed of Virginia, with whom Alan recorded over 140 tunes with. But in 1966, as Alan began to learn the regional fiddling style and tunes of the Upper South, he joined together with three other young musicians to form a band devoted to playing these old time tunes. They called themselves the Hollow Rock String Band, after the large outcropping of undercut rock formations outside of Durham where the band gathered for regular jam sessions and music parties. Little did they know at the time that this band would be at the core of an old time music scene that quickly blossomed in the Durham and Chapel Hill areas later. Other groups would eventually grow out of this old time revival scene, including the Fuzzy Mountain String Band and the Red Clay Ramblers, which will also play a part later in our story. Then, in September of 1969, Alan landed a job at the Library of Congress as the head of the Archive of Folk Song. Here, he would go on to supervise the development of the nation's largest archival collection of folk music. Which brings us to our legendary recording of Big Sciota. While at the archive, Alan heard about a certain West Virginia fiddler after a friend gave him some tapes he made on his tape recorder of a fiddler living in Pocahontas County. That fiddler's name was Burl Hammons. Upon hearing these recordings, Alan got excited and decided he would go down one weekend to pay a visit to this Burl fellow. So, one day in 1970, Alan eventually made his way over there, and there he found not just Burl, but a whole musical family. He was introduced to the family by a West Virginia student and banjo player who had just become acquainted with the Hammonds called Dwight Diller, who had basically discovered this musical family and encouraged them to start playing their old tunes after a long time of silence. Diller referred to the Hammonds family as, quote, the last of the 1700s type people remaining. Although Alan was there as a professional with the aim of recording and documenting for the library, visiting the Hammonds was anything but a formal visit. And as many later visitors would recall, paying a visit to the Hammonds family in the heart of Appalachia was a full-on immersive experience. Alan and his colleague, Carl Fleischhauer, who was also there to help document the sessions, were treated with hospitable friendship, electrified by the endless stories and music, as well as nourished by biscuits, beans, homemade applesauce, and the occasional pork chop. Alan would eventually make multiple trips to Burl's house over a 3 year period from 1970 to 1973, researching, recording, and documenting the history and traditions of Burl's family. The Hammonds had deep roots in Appalachia, having arrived in West Virginia from Kentucky before the Civil War, and eventually settling in Webster, Randolph, and Pocahontas counties. Many family members were known as some of the finest musicians in the mountains, playing and singing in ancient repertoire and holding on to a nearly lost performance style. The most well known of this family was Burl's uncle, Eden Hammonds, who once appeared in a World War II era newsreel fiddling for President Franklin Roosevelt, and many of Eden's recordings were made by a West Virginia University professor in 1947, which many consider some of the finest examples of old time fiddling of this region. But up to this time, Burl had never recorded any of his fiddling. Even though music was a big part of the family growing up, he never played professionally. He learned to play the fiddle at a young age, when he would sneak away his father's instrument when he wasn't around. At first, he just started fooling around with it, But eventually, he figured out how to play a tune or two, after which his father allowed him to develop his skills further. He eventually learned more tunes from his nephews and his uncles Pete and, of course, Eden. When he was a young boy, he recounted to Alan how some nights 15 to 20 guests would come over for supper to hear the family play the old tunes and tell stories. But the most common event for instrumental music was a dance at someone's home. A neighbor would clear out a room, and the tunes would go on all night long, being played on fiddle and banjo, but never a guitar, as Burl's sister recounts. She said, they never played on, never, hardly ever did see anybody playing guitar back then. It was fiddle and banjo. That's what they used. And some of them could play it darn. By around 1930, when Burl was in his 20s, the demands of work and family, as well as his father's sudden death, led him to stop playing music altogether, and he put his fiddle away. He would go on to work a variety of jobs, striking dynamite on a logging railroad, working as a cook, and raising chickens. Eventually, he started running a service station. The business produced a decent income, but as Burl recounts, the taxes and the paperwork were running him plumb crazy. That, and he couldn't find any reliable help. So he went back to raising chickens. So for a period of about 40 years, Burl never picked up his fiddle. And it wasn't just because he was too busy. The times had changed. The arrival of the phonograph and radio were bringing new music to the area, and friends and neighbors had lost interest in the old tunes, especially the younger generation. That is, until new interest brought upon by the folk revival caused a new generation of enthusiasts to rediscover this family in 1969. In 1970, when Allen eventually made his way to record Burl, he was living at his house in Stillwell. There was no indoor plumbing, just an outhouse and a spring running outside the back door. During one session, the boisterous household conversation, barking dogs, and passing traffic at the Hammonds home made it nearly impossible to capture a clear recording of Burl's fiddle playing. So, Alan rented a nearby motel room for the day, where he and Carl made recordings. You'll notice the foam sleeping pad on the floor, which he placed in order to help dampen the sound of Burl's loud foot tapping. And over those 3 years, Alan recorded dozens of Burl's tunes that had been passed down to him for generations, some of which may have been lost forever if not for Burl's tapes, as a few are in fact the only known source we have. And among one of these tunes was an obscure piece that up to that time no one else had ever recorded before. So here's Burl Hammond's, now legendary, 1972 recording of Big Sciota, and it's just great. You may have noticed that Burl's playing of this tune may sound a bit different than the versions you're used to. Hammonds played Big Sciota as a solo piece, without a lot of structure, dropping, adding, and repeating phrases as he saw fit. And it's not simply a crooked tune, it's even crooked in its, well, crookedness. I mean, sometimes he plays the high part straight, and sometimes he plays the low part crooked, and vice versa. And even the melody kind of shifts and changes with each pass. Allen released this version of Big Sciota for the Library of Congress, and in 1973, Rounder Records would release it on an LP entitled Shaking Down the Acorns, along with a 14-page booklet documenting the Hammonds family. And it was this album that would introduce Big Sciota to countless numbers of old time musicians during the 1970s. But here's the twist. Alan Jabbour wasn't the only one to make his way down to Burl's house and make a tape of this tune. Around this same time, members of the Fuzzy Mountain String Band also visited Burl, and they made a tape as well. if you remember earlier, this was also one of the bands that sprung out of that Durham Chapel Hill scene that Alan Jabbour and his band were part of as well. And of course, Burl being Burl, he played Big Sciota a little bit different on this recording as well. So in 1975, another Durham based band cut their own version based off of the Fuzzy Mountain tape. It was an album entitled Stolen Love by the Red Clay Ramblers. And like Alan Jabour's recording, this one too was very influential in spreading this tune around as well. So here we have two very influential records being released around the same time of a single tune which had never been recorded before by the same artist, but that sounds a little bit different. I'll play both versions back to back, the Library of Congress version and the Red Clay Ramblers. Each one of these recordings would then branch off, and in turn, throughout the 70s, led to two different styles of how Big Sciota was played, depending on which one was used. And this kind of explains why, even today, Big Sciota can be performed with so much variation. And if you've ever been to a jam and this song is called out, you'll know what I'm talking about. Sometimes the A part can be played pretty notey, and sometimes less so. Sometimes extra measures are added, and sometimes that B part goes from a C to E minor chord, and other times from E minor to C. You just have to be prepared. And music researchers have debated why Burl played this tune with so much variation. Some believe that the tune just lent itself to a certain amount of improvisation, while others think that it was maybe still in the process of development. And sometimes tunes do have to go through a certain evolution before they eventually work themselves out and settle into something more solid. And perhaps the tune is still evolving today, and we'll just have to wait and see if eventually it winds up with a more final and agreed upon form. But the melody isn't the only thing that varies with this piece. So before we get to how this number entered the bluegrass world, we also need to discuss that title. It's sometimes called Big Sciota, and other times Big Sciota. And I've also heard it pronounced Sciota and Scioti as well. And while the spelling variations are numerous, at least everyone pretty much agrees that the C in this case is silent. But what actually is this Big Sciota? In central and southern Ohio, there's a river that runs for about 230 miles called the Sciota River. Pronunciations of the river's name also varies by region, but it seems like most Ohioans refer to it as the Scioto, the next most common being the official Scioto. Just don't call it the Scioto. This river, which is the longest river that is entirely within the state of Ohio, flows down through Columbus and empties into the Ohio River at the Kentucky border, which brings us a bit closer to where the Hammonds family once lived, at least several generations ago. It was an important waterway for the Native Americans and early settlers for the entire region. The name itself comes from the Wyandot language of the Iroquois, who called it Skenodo, which translates in English to deer. And an interesting Jeopardy question, the Scioto River is actually depicted on the Ohio State seal and coat of arms. Oh, and just in case you're wondering, yes, there is a little Scioto River in Ohio as well. So that seems to be the likely source of the name. But the question remains, what about the source of the actual melody? Where did Burl get this tune from? And this is where the historical trail gets pretty dark, because the only documented reference we have of Burl's source is that he claimed to have learned this tune from his uncle Pete, and that's it. Like I mentioned before, this is our only recorded source of the tune, all other versions being made later and ultimately derived from Burl's tapes. So this trail seems to be pretty much a dead end. But I was able to find a tune that does have a striking resemblance to Big Sciota and may in fact be related. And it's a tune that was recorded back in 1942 by the Kentucky fiddler John Salyer from McGuffin County in Kentucky. It's called Kentucky Winder. Many music historians believe this tune to be related to Big Sciota. Give it a listen. I'll play both back to back. It's a great tune, and while clearly not identical, there is some striking similarity. And we do know that many of the tunes in Salyer's repertoire date to at least the mid and late 1800s, having learned many pieces from his father and many other relatives and neighbors. But we don't know with any certainty which tune may have derived from the other, or even if maybe they split off from an even earlier and lost source. And I'll briefly mention that at some point, it looks like lyrics have been added to Big Coyote as well. Although I couldn't confirm the source of where these lyrics actually came from, it does seem that Richie Stearns of the Horseflies was the first one to attach words to the tune. Here's a version of Big Coyote with lyrics by the Old Crow Medicine Show from off their 2001 EP.
I live by the river all my life. Don't know nothing but a strike. Can't go home again. I can't go home again. That's the highway road. Remember you have one soul. It's my blue-eyed baby, oh, my pretty blue-eyed baby, oh.
So that's Big Sciota from the Hammonds recording to the old time revival bands. But the person we can thank for helping to popularize Big Coyote with the bluegrass world was this man, the guitarist Russ Barenberg. Russ began playing guitar at the age of 13 in Chester County, Pennsylvania, west of Philadelphia. He was inspired early on by guitarists like Doc Watson, Mississippi John Hurt, and Clarence White, along with a wide range of old time bluegrass and folk and blues artists. While attending Cornell University in Ithaca, New York in 1970, Rush joined with Peter Wernick and Tony Trischka and others to form the band Country Cooking. Russ also played on a number of Trischka's solo albums throughout the 1970s. After Country Cooking disbanded in 1975, Russ temporarily switched to electric guitar and performed with a jazz rock band called Carried Away. Moving to Boston in 1979, he joined Matt Glazer and Jay Unger in the triple fiddle band called Fiddle Fever, recording two albums with the group. It was Fiddle Fever's recording of Ashokan Farewell, which was later used as the centerpiece for the soundtrack to Ken Burns' celebrated documentary, The Civil War. Russ played on the soundtracks for several other Burns films as well. While Russ was in Boston, he was also active in the vibrant old time contra dance scene, playing frequently for dances in the area. And it was while active in this scene, playing with a number of dance bands, that Russ learned tons of fiddle tunes. And one of these tunes he first heard was from the harmonica player, Mark Graham, called, of course, Big Sciota. He kept this tune in his back pocket and eventually moved to Nashville in the mid 80s, where he teamed up with Jerry Douglas and Edgar Meyer. After several years of collaborating, this trio eventually recorded an album in 1993. It was called Skip, Hop, and Wobble. It was a collection of original instrumentals, plus that old time contra dance tune he had discovered in Boston about a decade ago, Big Sciota. And I'll play a video recording of Russ and Jerry playing this tune in a second, but I do need to mention that this album was a pretty big deal at the time, and it was very influential in reshaping the direction of not just bluegrass, but a wide range of acoustic music for a whole new generation of pickers. And the year 1993 would be an important year for our story, not only because it marks the introduction and rebirth of Big Sciota into the bluegrass world with this recording, it was also the same exact year that Burl Hammons would pass away at the age of 84. And I'm glad I actually noticed this because while I usually skip over the last part of an old obituary, which just usually specifies the date and location of where the service is being held, I noticed that Burl's funeral service would be presided by one Reverend Dwight Diller. Yep, that's right, folks. That same Dwight Diller who visited Burl in 1969 and convinced him to pick up his fiddle again after 40 years of silence, and helped introduce him to Alan Jabbour and the rest of the world. Right after Big Sciota was released on this album, Russ also started introducing the tune at bluegrass camps and workshops the following year in 1994. And of course, as we all know, it caught on pretty well because it's basically a bluegrass instrumental standard at this point. So, folks, that's basically all I got on Big Sciota. I'll leave you with a little snippet of Russ playing Big Sciota, along with Jerry Douglas, Allie Bain, Jay Unger, and others. And it's just a pure joy to watch and listen to. Russ and the gang are just having a heck of a time playing this old tune that, thankfully, Burl Hammons kept around long enough in order for it to be rediscovered by another generation. It's one of my all time favorite music videos. Hope you enjoyed this one on Big Sciota, and once again, folks, thanks for listening.